that cut of reality reveals what is beneath, what has been hidden from us, right? It presents the world as we never thought of it.
So I am joined today by a very old friend of mine named Teddy Cruz. And in a moment, I'm going to have Teddy introduce himself because I can't really do it justice. But what I'll say is Teddy is an architect and an educator and an urbanist and mad scientist. And what we're going to be talking about today is something that I've noticed over the years. That I feel is one of Teddy's superpowers, which is, we were discussing it the other day, and one thing I see him do with his students is tricking them past their inhibitions. I would say that very often if Teddy has a student who they have something to express, but there's some blockage there or something, Teddy has all these different ways of interacting with his students that I feel just unleashes sort of creative expression in them. So that's what we'll be talking about in a moment. But before I do that, welcome, Teddy. And can you say a few words about who you are?
Yes, Rob, thank you. Thank you for inviting to this series of conversations about, I guess, I imagine the creative process and the way many of us engage the world to open up new horizons of possibility in relationship to others, obviously. That's to begin with, important thing. We construct our own identities in contact with others. And I'm telling you, my name is, well, Teddy Cruz, nothing to do with that bastard right-wing.
Ted great Cruz. Point.
Yeah. Just to begin with, because it's been a curse to, so Teddy Cruz, and I'm professor of public culture and urbanization in the visual arts department at University of California, San Diego, where I also co-direct the Center on Global Justice at UCSD with my partner, Fona Foreman, who is a political theorist. And we have basically joined forces, architect, artist in public culture, political theorist, really in shaping socio-ecological urban lab at the university. And the focus has been the border region. We are really an embedded practice in this geography of conflict, working with marginalized communities on both sides of the wall, engaging them to really co-produce knowledge, but also co-develop the city with the resources of the university, redirecting them to many of these environments so that communities can be in charge of their own modes of productivity. So culture, the construction of a new type of civic imagination, in a sense, departing from the bottom up, engaging these environments that have suffered so much, has been really what organizes a lot of our work. And yes, as Rob was mentioning, that has provoked us to really figure out other modalities of engagement with students in terms of opening up the creative processes, ranging from a more expressionistic sort of way of engaging that process through art making, loosely speaking, but also how to build a more critical attitude to thinking about processes, meaning it's not only the process of creating images on the canvas, but also it's about understanding that we belong to histories of, obviously, of oppression, of marginalization, we are constructed by institutions. And so now the work also in terms of entering a more creative, critical thinking, let's say, to understand our position, our place in that history, has prompted the work to really deal with other modalities beyond the expressionistic tools, but more about constructing critical positions about really the world. So anyway, from expression to an intuition to the way of shaping a new type of epistemology, I would call it, based on critical history.
And one thing to give people a little context, so I was thinking about it, and I realized that we met probably 30 years ago now, I think. And I met, it's amazing, right?
I show it, you don't show it. But yes, I mean, yeah, so much time has gone by, yes.
And and remarkably, we met probably, 40 steps from where you're located at UCSD. Right, the original School of Architecture was there, and that's where I met Teddy. So some of what I'm talking about today, and that inspired me to have this conversation, might uh, might be a reflection on some of Teddy's earlier process. You know, but it is a thread that I've seen over the years that I think the word that you said just now that is a consistent element is that there's a provocation of
Mhm.
the individual in such a way that is perhaps releasing something. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you do that, when you're setting up assignments or a context for people to create.
Mhm.
Why don't we start there?
Yeah, I mean, to begin with, I think a lot of the desire or the interest, in opening up new processes for detonating really this creative, intelligence are in themselves a critique of our educational system, and by
Mm,
that I mean more the American model, as different from many other places in the world, meaning the kind of typical fact-oriented multiple choice questionnaire that dominates for issues of efficiency, I imagine, the construction of knowledge based on definitions,
mm.
uh, rather than multiple associations. And so the multiple choice sort of questionnaire, right? I mean, question, and you have
There's
to
a
choose.
narrowing.
And
Yeah.
and yeah, and by the way, it's not to say that I'm critiquing fact-oriented only, or data or scientific model education, because who was going to imagine that in our time we were going to be in defense? We artists, we were going to be in defense of facts,
Mm.
as what it's essential to produce the evidence, really to tackle injustice. Because I'm saying that because usually artists depend not so much on the objective, factual foundation of information, but it's more about creative speculation in that sense, right? So anyway, but all I'm saying is that to begin with is a critique of a very narrow idea of education, as opposed to my own education, like from Guatemala in Latin America, or even the French model, which is more about essay writing. I mean, the moment you write and you have to really use the information to produce a more interesting set of relationships, let's say. So it's
Oh,
associative thinking. So it's about understanding the world through the complexity of relations, like a relational
mm,
complexity,
mm.
where the viewer or we who experience that information need to take a position in realigning and recombining that information. You see what I'm trying to say? So yes, a lot of it has to do with producing moments of rupture. Why not to call it? I mean, I think that
Mm.
in that sense, very surrealistic or act. I remember one of the major premises of surrealist artists was that the moment of rupture is that moment where you really cut reality. By that I mean even the canvas, or even a moment, a gesture that you inscribe on emptiness, or that cut of reality reveals what is beneath, what has been hidden from us, right?
Mm.
It tells the world as we never thought of it. It defamiliarizes, it goes beyond our own conventions and our own fears. So yes, for a moment, the pushing of students to really engage in more what is called phenomenological sort of method, which is
Oh,
really about a perceptual, subjective, set of interpretations that are mobilized by that act of rupture, where we begin to
so
notice, all the stuff, that we didn't notice before. Do you remember that movie? I actually like that. I always share this with my students, that movie, a girl with a pearl earring or something like that.
I
Do you
didn't see
remember?
it.
It is it is a movie about Vermeer, the painter, famous
Yeah.
Dutch painter. And basically, it's about the movie of how the painter has this sort of interesting relationship with his maid, who she picks into the studio where he's mixing colors, and she's so interested that he says, "Come in," and he teaches her to really open up a set of sort of sensibilities about color. And anyway, at some point in the movie, she is looking up to the sky on the window, and then he comes in and says, "What is the color of the sky?" And she says, "Gray." But then she said, "No, based on what we've been doing, and why don't you just look closer?" And she looks, and then she begins to understand that there are gray, that there are blues, that there are violets, that there are what we, in a very flat-footed way, the way we understand the world, so the kind of one-dimensionality of our dormant perceptions hijacked by a horrendous education that is anti-art in that sense. All of a sudden, she begins to discover that that reality is a lot more nuanced, a lot more layered, a lot more complex. And that's it. The moment of rupture is to push all of us to look at the world through its complexity. And at that point, begin to really recombine that in order to produce ways of narrativizing, ways of expressing, you know what I mean, what that complexity do to our own lives, or does to our own lives.
One thing I'm going to do in this talk, and I apologize, is I'm going to oversimplify some of what you're talking about, or contextualize it in a certain way. And so I think that's some of the kind of theoretical underpinnings that have provoked some of how you teach. When I look at some of the elements, interacting with you over the years, if we simplify it, it's okay. It might be a student with a blank drawing in front of them, and there's an impetus to draw something. And what I saw you doing was having a series of prompts that would allow somebody to start to engage in a particular way, but also interrupt them and kind of cause that cut that you're talking about, or cause a second look or interpretation of the work, right? So I would be really curious to hear about, what motivated you to pick certain prompts. Like, I remember one exercise we did years ago where, the person draws for, 15 minutes with a number 2 pencil. And then at a certain point you say, okay, your second tool maybe is an eraser. And now it's adding a second layer there, or okay, now we're going to introduce a frame that you have a 3x3 frame, and you have to pick one moment. So I find that these little restrictions or prompts that you did actually had the effect of freeing students in some way. So
see, yes, I mean, it's precisely that. It's really coming up with some prompts that, and I like the way you put it, that tricks the maker into taking what I call unexpected detours, which would undermine or challenge the assumptions that we bring into any process or any endeavor. And what I found is that many times when we began a drawing, and again, this is talking about the kind of the courses that I used to teach. I mean, on drawing, which were a lot more about expressionism in that sense. And so it's beginning with the white canvas, obviously the paper, the importance of having many materials around that paper. I mean, there is not just one medium, but opening up the availabilities, I would call, right? That for intuitive and accidental sort of ways of making things, even opposite media to collide, to engage. So anyway, just to have a lot of material around. And so every time it would be very ritualistic. And even when we would begin the class, it would be setting up the paper, caring very much about the paper, In fact, often we would mask the surface that we were of the paper so that we would frame the area of that was going to be very intense in terms of the markings, so that later we would unmask and in the white of the paper would compress and would frame, and so it would dramatize those gestures. So it's not, so there was a careful orchestration in a way, this kind of staging of the experiment. But then it was the issue, okay, let us begin interacting and loosely, right? Yeah, let us just, there is always this fear, right, of marking this white paper, and that also is part of the experiment, is to defeat a bit or suspend that fear, how to produce a more, yes.
Well, so let me double click on that, because I think that moment of fear, I would love to hear how you're encouraging students, because that's at least at the beginning of the making, that's the first kind of border, right? It's like, oh my God, what can I draw?
There's a lack of, isn't that interesting? It's a lack of confidence and a lack of trust in our own markings.
Yes.
Because what has been instilled in us is that to draw is to draw the literalness of the world. I mean, just to draw perfectly. When in reality, I mean, I differentiate drawings from even diagrams, so that drawings in that way can be just descriptive. And I always say they describe reality. The experiment has to do more with just confronting the drama of a smudge, to understand that in the erasing of a graphite, there is a set of traces that are also full of information, but also affective, emotional content. So, but we don't trust the accidents, or we don't trust the mistakes even. So again, back to the critique of education that hijacks and restricts that more fluid rapport with the world, but also with materials. So yes, defeating that inhibition and then opening up a first moment of scratching the paper is always a struggle. But what I found out is that 90% of the time, when they began drawing, they would begin drawing with a geometry, circles, triangles, or a star, or like, it's always about this symmetry and this centrality and this sort of way of controlling. So I decided what we need to do is a series of prompts to, in fact, or sequences. Okay.
To help get people out of that rigid first attempt.
Exactly.
You know, as
so for
talking,
example, one experiment was, instead of beginning with a marking, we began with covering the entire surface of the paper with charcoal. So we would go from the white to black, and instead of drawing with pencil, we would erase. Right, and so
it's carving.
It was about carving, and all of a sudden, the dialogue with the surface and with the material was a very different one, and it allowed more fluidity, less fear in that sense. Anyway, sorry I interrupted you.
Well, no, and one thing that's occurring to me is, if I think like, okay, the state of mind that perhaps you're in when you're first confronting a drawing, and then the point that they get to through some of your prompts is, the first state of mind is one of like, oh, I have to make something that will be hung on a wall and people will look at, and I have to get it right. And then the state that you help move people into is actually a dialogue with the piece itself. You know, it's very much very interactive. And what I was remembering, Teddy, was when I was working on my thesis back when I was studying architecture, and just to give people context, I was really screwed in that I had no idea what I was doing. The deadline was coming up, and I flew down to see Teddy in San Diego, and I told him what my situation was, and he basically said, well, you're screwed. But after he said that, we set up paper, and he said, get to work. And what I remember most was my initial interaction with the paper was so stiff, and you came over and just like attacked the paper. I mean, that was interesting alone, is that you
Mm.
were jumping in on my drawing, and it was more of a jam session, but sort of teaching me about this interaction with the drawing. That was amazing. So that all sort of came
That's
back to
that's
me.
that's
Remember
in,
that?
yeah, yeah. No, now I do. That's interesting. Uh
And you
yes,
were kind of saying to me, like, you got to
yeah.
loosen up your body. It's like,
Well, that's the thing. Yeah, you're right. I mean, we never think of it, but drawing is what we would call an embodied experience in that sense. I mean, that
mm,
again, back to the normative or the conventions of drawing,
mm,
and I've seen it all the time, is that the way we hold a pencil, the way we hold, a pencil is always very close to the tip,
mm,
and that really restricts movement.
mm,
When you look at actual, like, people who really draw loosely, they hold a pencil farther from the tip.
mm,
And
mm,
in fact, the most expressionistic, is about the whole arm and the whole
mm.
body. So doing drawings that are more on larger surfaces, it really brings the entire body into it. So yeah, but you are right. Is how to produce that dialogue, and with the paper, and that requires really moments of almost, how would I call it? I mean, lending yourself to really just beginning the journey, right? I mean, just tracing, because part of the thing is also reacting. It's an action reaction situation,
Yeah.
and you are visually training your eye and your senses to really discern, almost to choose, and to, about where to erase, or where to deepen the color, or you know what I mean. So, but if we don't manifest anything on the paper, it's very difficult to find those, you know what I mean. So I always refer to it as a kind of archaeological task, almost, of
Mm,
digging and revealing, and burying, and digging. It's like this sort of process of action reaction. There is a beautiful metaphor that I always also, that was very inspired in this process, which is that of the palimpsest, which is, as you remember, the palimpsest is the papyrus, the old papyrus, the ancient, because there was no paper, so
mm,
people would draw or write, and then would erase and write again, and so, but that produced a kind of accumulation of layers
mm,
that had this patina, this sort of
mm,
very interesting depth to it. So it's very much that. A lot of the exercises that I began to advance were really allowing the viewer or the maker to really produce a palimpsest that had a lot of depth, so that your eyes, would begin to create associations, and the way of reading the
mm,
surface, you know what I mean?
mm,
And that's the reason, by the way, there is somebody who wrote something about why is it that many artists love to look at old walls, where the material is really, and the paint is really through time, has created this layered, as opposed to this very metal kind of finish,
mm.
which is
Right.
very, and so it's very much about that. I think in the beginning of this exercise is always trying to produce what I would call a kind of visual literacy of opening up sensibilities to a gradation of values. And that's the
Mm,
reason I'm very conservative when it comes to education related to the computer, even though obviously the computer is an incredible instrument. But now
yeah.
in the schools, students don't even know the value of a fucking smudge, like an
Mm,
erasure, and the lines are all the same thickness. There's
mm,
no, and then drawing with these mechanical pencils, that really, it's all about this standardization and the monodimensionality of the expression. So that for me, the thickness, that's the reason, remember, a lot of the materials were very thick graphite,
yeah.
and charcoal, and
And pastels, and yeah, yeah.
pastels, and that kind of thing.
Well, one thing that I
The
found,
moment of attacking, the moment of literally beginning the journey,
well, yeah. So, my experience was I'm there, I'm rigid, I'm trying to draw something, and then you come over and sort of shatter the glass in my drawing, and start getting me engaging with it. the, I think whether it's framing the canvas, which was something that we did also, and kind of a layered approach to, okay, now I'm going to work with one color. Now I'm going to introduce more of an eraser. The effect that that had with me as somebody being very rigid and very inhibited was each layer took a little bit of the burden off the previous layer to be profound. But I think for me, a lot of the inhibition comes from this drawing has to be just fucking amazing, right? And then you look at what you're drawing and you're like, oh, it's not that great. But when you add another layer, all of a sudden there's depth in the way the two layers are interacting. And you start to see kind of the compositional impact. So it's not about any one element in the
That's right.
drawing. At least that was my experience.
Yeah, no, that's very good. I think that is keeping yourself open in that sense, and even willing to destroy the very favorite part of the drawing that that you wanted to preserve. And that, by the way, opens up another issue here, which is really about how conflict can become a creative energizer, how would you call it? And that's the reason I had a lot of,
Catalyst.
I had a lot of tension with many of the participants, because sometimes I would come and there was this thing that was being protected for some reason, and I would come and erase it, or I mean, really, I mean, that at some point, or not erase the entire thing, but just alter it, and it was like this moment of but that opened up this other way of looking at the very detail. So it was this in that sense. What I remember also is that it was a more, I don't know if to say communitarian or more complex way of intervening. It was not only the author, it was myself interacting and debating and really producing an interface in the making, but also it was the rest of the class, and so we were moving around constantly. So there's something about the collective nature of drawing in this sense that helped us also accept maybe the view of the other. But yes, I didn't do that often, by the way, that coming and destroying, but I would always try to push about.
Although I think you encouraged us to do that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
I remember times specifically where you literally said, pick your favorite part of the drawing and erase it, right? And for me, that kind of prompt helps me get over this rigid preciousness with the drawing, and it starts to build a confidence that you're going to come to something again that you might have the same affection for.
Right.
So, because I think a lot of the inhibition comes from everything's like too important. I might say the wrong thing.
That's right. That's right. Which is so, isn't that interesting? I mean, obviously, I'm not suggesting then that the drawing will be perennially under construction, because then when do you finish, right? When do you understand that there is something valuable that emerges that needs to be finally preserved and you're done? Remember that beautiful segment in that another movie, the 6 Degrees of Separation, which was a play. Remember when the man is having a dream of how all these kindergarten students, he says the teacher is hanging their drawings, and all the drawings look like Matisse. I mean, all the drawings look at this gestural, and the guy says, "My God, how do you do this?" And I said, the teacher said, "Nothing. I just take the paper away." Because they can endlessly, so yeah, it is. So on one hand, it's really unleashing how to open up our capacity to intuitively manifest, right, on the paper, like the power of the gesture itself, have to let it out. But that also implies stopping to control the destiny of things in that sense. I mean, that as you said,
say more about that.
It's about controlling. It's like a lot of it's about planning or anticipating in the way of assuming and controlling the result. And so, in a sense, the creative process would have to be for a moment about challenging that control and how to negotiate it, because I imagine control and setting up some rules for yourself once you are more comfortable with the drawing, by the way. I mean, I think that if anything, the whole exercise was to produce a level of trust, of accepting levels of intuition, of increasing the value of the sensibilities that are dormant, right? I mean, it's coming out of the closet in a way, really, and really accepting that there is something that is talking to you in very different ways. But so what I'm trying to say is that at that moment when you're a lot more comfortable, there are moments when you are beginning to develop a language and develop ways of, in other words, setting up some rules for ourselves. So I'm not talking about that control is negative, but there has to be.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of constraint
constraint
is very useful,
exactly.
right?
It's very useful, that's right. And how to develop a kind of sensibility to negotiate and constantly dance between the planned and the unplanned. I mean, and that's, by the way, what I've learned a lot as an architect by engaging the many informal settlements that spring up in the edges of Tijuana. As you know, that has been a lot of our research, is self-built, incrementally built, layered structures that emerge in marginal zones as people recycle. And so it's similar, that process really of beginning with something that is
very
useful.
Interesting. Yeah.
Generate, you know, so anyway, so how to navigate the planned and the unplanned is part of the experiment as well.
I mean, one thing that I found also really useful in your prompts is, to put it simply, I think another place that I get stuck besides the fear of the blank page is what I just call like just the revulsion with what's emerging on the page. Like I'll be drawing something and I'm just like, oh my God, I hate this. And that moment of revulsion can really freeze me. And so then if I hear you say, pick up an eraser and try something, or pick up a different color and try something, it gives me a next step. And it kind of gives me a way of re-engaging and perhaps taking the conversation a little bit further.
Yes,
so,
and that requires a high degree, I feel, also not only of willingness and, you know, to alter the existing situation, adapt it, and be free to really completely transform it. But that requires also the support systems, I would say, meaning the materials. So that's the reason the prompts had to do with creating high degrees, how would I call it, frequent, to increase the frequency of change. In other words, working with charcoal for 2 minutes and then forcing yourself to bring in the tape, or on mask, and then maybe the erasure 7 minutes later, and then back to charcoal. And so to increase the frequency of material intervention can support that, you know, that construction of a more layered palimpsest, again, a more layered surface that you can now respond to, because and that you can now dig through. It's almost like you're constructing the landscape to then maybe reorganize it and and dig through it. But yes, that helped a lot. I remember the idea that we could move from material to material to force a very different rapport, right, with the surface. And that has to do all about temporalities. I mean, really about moving in one direction and then allowing another thing to come in, and in that, which, by the way, that's another topic, time itself, the frequencies, rhythms, the rhythms of engagement, and then retreating. And then
I think, again, in my experience of it, the time you worked with me then, and a couple of times I went to your class, looking back, I realized you had confidence about where we would all get to. I certainly didn't have the confidence. Like if you asked me, will this drawing result in something, an hour later, I would definitely say no, if I was being honest. But I think, The feeling is almost like you're a chef and you're just saying, "Hey, Rob, put this on the stove and add this now and add a little bit of this," and you have a confidence this is going to turn out great, right? This is going to work out, or it's going to be an okay meal, right?
Mhm.
And so I realize now is like, I think we were borrowing from your confidence that somehow through this set of prompts we would arrive someplace of interest.
Interesting. Well, that's the reason I was saying it's important because it became a conversation between us. The drawing
Yeah.
became like the excuse of that conversation. But and obviously because I had, because of my own interest in drawing and particular genres of art. In this case, I'm very much in love with abstract expressionism in that sense. So in other words, I also had a kind of sensibility about seeing things and understanding where certain compositions were moving in interesting directions.
Mm.
But that's the thing. At the end of the day, all of them were very abstract. As you remember, it was just really, really the power of the gestures, and some of them had to do with maybe more density. Other ones went with the rhythms and the repetition of texture and patterns. There were a variety. It's not that all of the drawings were the same, but they were really, at the end of the day, not figurative at all. I mean, they were all just trying to
Right. This
create.
isn't drawing a flower vase or something.
That's right. They were not really exactly. Which again, for me, was just because the whole exercise was about simply doing that, producing that rupture or that moment of defamiliarizing, ourselves from the object of control. So it was just really about. It was really about just the power of the gesture and abstraction, and to make the maker comfortable with that rapport, right? By the way, that's also maybe a way of really addressing the way of also drawing realistic things. I mean, because to tell you the truth, for me, one of when all of this interest began, and I told you this story a long time ago. I was studying architecture in Guatemala, which, by the way, even though it was a very technical education in architecture, the first 2 years of education in the architecture school were oriented to incredible artistic, like creating or developing artistic sensibilities. So we would draw with graphite. We would draw like hundreds of pages just of moving and being comfortable with our hand. And so 2 years of drawing outside in the city, going to parks and drawing, monuments. So I remember one day all the class was around this monument in Guatemala City, and the professor, who was very technical in drawing, we asked us to have this technical pencil, the one that I was criticizing, which is like with, and then he tells us the whole recipe, right, of how to understand proportions, that you stretch your arm and you with the pencil, you measure the object and this and that, and then you transfer that to a grid, and then you begin to understand.
Wow.
So I was freaking out, like with pencil and trying to following the instructions, and then I decided for a moment to take a little break and see what other people were doing. And as I'm walking around, I see this crazy guy who became my best friend in those days, not drawing with a damn mechanical pencil, nor with that, but he just was literally with a thick, like 6B pencil, like I swear he was like, in this sort of crazy rapport with the paper, and he was drawing the monument in the most amazing way, and so that changed me. I never went back to that damn mechanical pencil, but I understood that again, it is that rapport, right? That interface that between a more, how would I call it, more prescriptive way of understanding, and the need for injected into the drawing itself, the more unique idiosyncratic gesture, you know what I mean? And so on. So anyway, that was a wake-up call for me.
Wow, what an amazing experience. It's like you, through your friend, you understood expression. right? You
Right.
understood, okay, he sees this, and here's this beautiful representation of it that has nothing to do with precision, and yet it captures it.
Mhm.
Wow.
And maybe it could be that he already knew about perspective and he was more comfortable. Right. But what the main lesson for me was to loosen up, please, loosen up. I mean, just to bring into the drawing your idiosyncratic markings. They are valuable, and eventually, by the way, that's what is important in developing one's own language. You know what I mean? Like even the gestures, even though the drawings were all the same, maybe potentially in our class, as you remember, in terms of being all abstract, very dramatic and very charged. But a lot of them have very different content.
Absolutely.
In terms of scale and patterns. And I've always been very interested about how through that one begins to connect to a more fundamental idea of sort of the language, the expressive language. I remember in one of the exercises I did in Los Angeles at the School of Architecture there at SciArc, and it was like dozens of students, and we put the drawings, charcoal drawings on the wall, and the parents of this Chilean student came to visit, and I asked him, you know, who do you think is your daughter's drawing? And it was weird. They went exactly to her drawing, and I don't know if it had to do with the fact that they recognize, you know, I don't know. All I'm saying is there is something about the coming to terms with those sort of tonalities, gestures. So there is a language in the way, in our expression, the way we speak, in the way we, articulate, in a way we move our I mean, there is something very idiosyncratic that needs to be brought into the creative process as well, because that remains a little bit hidden. I think that was part of the exercise as well.
I mean, part of what really made an impression on me, being around you and seeing your other students, you know, sometimes I think in terms of computers, and I would see a student go into a box on one side being very inhibited, and then on the other side of the box, you know, the box being your class, they would come out being expressive, you know. And I'd been around other teachers where the effect was quite the opposite. You know, I had a teacher who shall remain nameless at Berkeley, who I went into the class because he had all the right rhetoric, and his promise was, I'm going to unleash you creatively. And, you know, and it was like going into an inverted funnel where he actually had the opposite effect, that by the time I came out of there, I felt like I was in a straitjacket. And so, you know, that's why I became very intrigued with your process, because I would see people go in who were very quiet or, you know, not very outspoken people, and then they'd come out with these amazing expressions and an enthusiasm about making more. So
yes, what comes to mind, well, there are two things. One is based on what you were saying that I remember, because it's also about a long-term situation. Obviously, you emerge with maybe a bit from the classes. I remember from the workshops more than with a little more facility, potentially more trust, more openness, fluidity, etc. And that really, I've heard from many people that it really was instrumental in shaping agendas for themselves in their own lives, but also many of them who really follow an artistic route, in a sense. So how important all of that was. And it reminds me of what I used to, also stories that I would tell students as part of this, because as they were drawing, I was telling stories a bit at times. But I don't know if you remember this one of the Watts Towers. I think I told you that in Los Angeles.
I'm not sure.
Watts Towers, which I get everybody hopefully knows. These are these strange needle-like sculptures that Simon Rodia, the man who built them back in the 20s, built in the back of his backyard in LA, East LA, when nothing, you know, it was just really in the edges of Los Angeles, in the periphery of Los Angeles. And the story of the Watchtowers is that Simone Rodia, the immigrant, the Italian immigrant who ended up in this little tract home in those days, you know, that he woke up one day, he says, after a dream, that he wanted, he needed to build the bell tower of his little hill town from Italy. And that he needed to build a reproduction of that tower in the backyard of his house. And he decided to start doing it little by little. He would go to work in the factory, come back. And on the way, he would pick up a lot of debris, a lot of waste, a lot of trash, and his idea was to build a damn tower. I mean, like the literal tower. But it took him 20 years.
Wow.
Of constructing, stitching, engaging the material, threading it. So the previous image of the literal bell tower transformed into this strange set of needles that only that process in the long term really enabled him to do. And there are many more stories about it. I mean, nobody knows where he ended up. He finished the needles, and people say that he just gave the key of his house to his neighbor and he left. I don't know. Nobody knows. But the point is that the towers became the community symbol, really, of civil rights, and, as you know, in East LA, and social justice and all of that. So it's a beautiful story about how the creative process begins with a subjective moment of will, passionate engagement of the existing real, and engaging it through a process that often is unpredictable. And it is that unpredictability of what will be created that really facilitates, I hate to sound too academic about this, but the transference of that subjective moment to become, in fact, a more collective, community-oriented sort of, you know, it's a beautiful story. But all I'm saying is that what you were describing is that is a recognition that these things take time, and that it is, in that sense, it really begins to connect to our own lives. I mean, and the way we construct our own, you know, engagement with our own desires. There is that beautiful song of Silvio Rodriguez. You remember how I love protest music from the 60s in Latin America, but where he says, you know, fine, I know you constructed your life and everything, but guess what? All I know is that you ended up being the person who you did not want to be. So an act of confrontation. I think the drawing is an act of confrontation in this case, and it takes a long time. And that's it. But there was the other dimension of this, but I don't know if there is time to talk about it, which is how this whole experiment with images, with materials, with a more expressionistic and abstract artistic sort of processes. Now that I've
Teddy, do you have a few more moments?
Yes, we can finish. I mean, we could take maybe 5-6 more minutes. I mean, is that okay? I mean,
perfect. Yeah. No, okay,
yeah.
Great.
So just to say that we don't have to go too deep into it, but I began to realize at some point that obviously it's important to begin everything by confronting ourselves, and that it is developing our own health, I would imagine, socio-emotionally, and in terms of our fluidity, again, to get our sensibilities out to really guide things. But at the same time, I began to realize that it was not enough. At the same time, that we are, as I mentioned earlier, institutionally built, and a lot of the experiments visually that I've been doing recently with my visual arts students at UCSD, the experiments are less oriented to the expressionistic gesture, but more about digging up a lot of questions and narratives that we might not be involving in the creative process. So I teach this course that is about diagrams. It's diagramming. There's a whole sort of research about this. I mean, what I was saying earlier, the difference between a drawing and a diagram is that the drawing often is just too descriptive of reality, but the diagram, for example, the drawing of a tree would be the shape of the tree. But if we were to abstract the tree to understand how the tree performs, how the leaves receive energy from the sun, transfer that energy into photosynthesis, transfer that further into the trunk and the roots into a network of fungi that then, so there is a performative dimension to everything that we are not paying attention to. And so part of the diagram of the tree wouldn't look like the tree. It would look at a series of vectors of light and transferences and da-da-da. And so diagrams perform the information they contain. And so I ask the students in art to produce a diagram of their own practice,
Very interesting.
their own practice to open up all the issues. So it's about what I was saying earlier, to build up a critical position in their own work, because it could be that they were so enamored with the painting and the little size, and that they were so comfortable with that, and that's what their practice is about. But when they begin to question what their work is about, and they realize that that little painting was not really, shouldn't be what, maybe it was 3 times as large, and maybe it was, so I developed that based on a series of charts that are very interesting. One of them is called the 5 W's, which is why, who, where, when, what. So for example, the why might be answering questions very briefly. So it's constructing a language, by the way, too. So the why might be, okay, if I was to ask you, what are the main issues that move your practice? What are the critical issues that really you are addressing? So the construction of so it's about your sensibilities, the critical issues. So all the framing, it's very interesting to respond to those questions. The who is the audience? If, it could be that it's just you. And if it is just you, what is it about you? Can you open up a series of conditions that are about your subjectivity, or it could be that it's institutions that you are engaging with, or community. Who is your audience? Where is location? So you can see it's a plethora, an array of critical questions that the students begin to just with scripting. And that produces incredible information that is, again, once again, back to the complexity. But instead of being gestures, in this case, because many of them are already very good at, loose. But in this case, they begin to frame their practice more critically, finding hidden zones of interest that were not being paid attention, who will now have to be connected to media. It could be many people in this exercise have realized that maybe painting was not their medium, by the way. That it was something else. Well, anyway, all I'm saying is that the work has morphed into a way of framing critically what we do, why, and for whom, and what is the process.
Which is a completely different starting point. I think we can probably still find these kind of pure elements of provocation that you're doing. I mean, today I apologize that we sort of stripped the meaning out of it and got back to perhaps the just not representation, but expressive image of a drawing. And that was sort of the context. And now we can sort of layer meaning back on top of it, it sounds like where you're going even more deeply now. So
I like that.
Maybe we can go there next time.
Wrapping it up is that, yes, we are not only constructors of things, we are also building a discourse, a language. And I think that to be able to find in those expressions new meanings, new interpretations, you know what I mean, that have consequences in terms of what we say and where we stand, is to build up a commitment to that. You know what I mean? That is part of, it's a double-ended two-pronged approach. Okay, well,
great.
This is so good to reconnect. This is maybe this is the first chapter on.
I hope so. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Teddy. I really appreciate it.
All right. We'll connect soon again.
Great.
Okay.